Glass shattered in the kitchen. Emily froze, clutching her stuffed giraffe tighter against her chest. Her fever made the world tilt, but she knew something was wrong. The heavy thud of unfamiliar footsteps echoed through the darkened house. Check. "Upstairs?" a harsh voice whispered. "I'll look down here." Through the crack in her bedroom door, Emily saw a beam of light skitter across the hallway wall. Her throat tightened. She wanted to call out, but fear pinned her silent. Where was Mrs. Parker? Where was Max? The floorboard outside her room creaked. The door eased open. A tall figure in black stood in the doorway, his face half covered by a mask. His lips curled into a twisted smile when he spotted the small girl huddled beneath her blanket. Well, what do we have here?" he murmured, stepping closer. A low, rumbling growl came from the shadows behind him. The man barely had time to turn before 80 pounds of muscle and fur launched through the air. Max, eyes locked on his target, teeth bared. In that frozen moment, as Max's powerful body collided with the intruder, only one question remained. Would this loyal protector's sacrifice be enough to save the child who had saved him? Emily Williams wasn't like other 5-year-olds. While neighborhood children played tag, their laughter ringing through the streets, Emily stood apart, her deep blue eyes absorbing everything, but rarely meeting anyone's gaze. 6 months earlier, she had been diagnosed with high-functioning autism. She lived in a world where sounds were too sharp, lights too bright, and unexpected touches felt like fire. Overwhelmed by chaotic surroundings, she retreated to the safety of her bedroom, where stuffed animals sat in careful rows, and books were stacked just right. She spoke rarely. When she did, it was in whispers, or through the voice of her beloved giraffe Spot. Her teacher once called her brilliantly trapped. She could count hundreds of objects in an instant, but couldn't bear the unpredictable noise of the school cafeteria. The lightest touch could send her recoiling, yet she craved deep pressure. Weighted blankets wrapped tightly around her small frame, grounding her. Most nights, Emily sat by her bedroom window, staring up at the stars, methodically counting and recounting constellations, as if she focused hard enough, the universe might reveal its hidden pattern. Dr. Sarah Williams rushed through life with the precision of the pediatric surgeon she was. Her days were measured in saved lives and missed dinners. At 42, the dark circles beneath her eyes had become permanent. Her copper hair, hastily pulled back, always seemed to have loose strands escaping, mirroring the exhaustion she barely contained. Since Michael had left, taking his warmth and patience with him, Sarah had struggled to bridge the gap between medical expertise and the bewildering challenge of raising her own daughter. She understood brain anatomy perfectly, yet Emily's mind remained a beautiful mystery she couldn't solve. Her colleagues admired her steady hands, capable of repairing the tiniest vessels in a newborn's heart, but they never saw those same hands tremble when trying to soothe her daughter's meltdowns. She kept photos of Emily on her desk, tiny reminders of what she was working for, even as she missed school plays, therapy sessions, and bedtime stories because another emergency surgery took priority. Max hadn't always been afraid of gunshots and sudden movements. Once, he had been one of the most formidable members of the K-9 unit, a German shepherd with a sharp mind, powerful build, and unwavering loyalty. Then came the rainy Tuesday. Officer Jenkins, his handler and partner for 6 years, stepped in front of a bullet meant for a civilian. The trauma left Max with a jagged scar across his left shoulder and a wound inside that no veterinarian could fix. After months of failed rehabilitation, he was deemed too skittish for service, no longer fit for duty. The department had no choice but to retire him, leaving his future uncertain. When Dr. Williams first met him, his deep brown eyes held a haunted vigilance. Once proud and commanding, his posture was now slightly hunched, as if bracing for another loss. And yet in moments of calm, glimpses of his former self emerged, head high, ears alert. The instinct to protect still burned beneath his wounded spirit. The decision to adopt Max wasn't made lightly. Sarah stood in the sterile hallway of the Animal Rehabilitation Center, gripping a folder filled with behavioral assessments. Through the viewing window, she watched Max pace his enclosure. Beside her, Officer Daniels, a veteran of the force, spoke with quiet conviction. "He's not dangerous," he said. His weathered face softened as he glanced at the German shepherd. "Just broken, in ways we couldn't fix. For police work, perhaps, but maybe, just maybe, he still had something left to protect." Max was hyper-vigilant, sleeping little. Sarah recognized the symptoms instantly. K-9 PTSD. She had seen the same. Haunted alertness in military veterans who passed through her hospital. It wasn't Max's condition that gave her pause, but the murmurs from her colleagues when she mentioned adopting a retired police dog for Emily. A traumatized animal with a special needs child? That's irresponsible. Dr. Roberts had scoffed over coffee in the surgeon's lounge. Even her mother called it another one of your impulsive decisions, comparing it to the pottery studio Sarah had opened and abandoned within a year before. Medical school. But something in Max's eyes, wary yet gentle, reminded her of Emily's. They both saw everything, processed the world differently, held depths that others overlooked. Against all recommendations, Sarah signed the adoption papers that afternoon. "I'm either making the best decision of my life," she told Officer Daniels, "or the worst. There doesn't seem to be any middle ground." The neighborhood association meeting erupted into heated debate just 3 days after Max moved in. "It's a public safety issue," argued Walter Finch, 2 doors down, his jowls quivering with indignation. "That dog was trained to attack people." Sarah stood at the community center podium, gripping its wooden edges until her knuckles turned white. Max was trained to apprehend suspects under specific commands. Commands that only his handler knew, she corrected, her professional calm strained. Those commands died with Officer Jenkins. She didn't mention how Max had spent his first night in their home pressed against the laundry room wall, trembling at every passing car, or how the next morning she had found Emily curled up beside him on the floor, her small hand resting on his paw. Then Margaret Chin, the retired elementary school teacher across the street, stood up. "I've watched that little girl sit alone in her yard for 3 years while the other children played together," she said firmly. "Yesterday, I saw her walking that dog around the garden, talking to him, actually speaking words. If that's not medicine, I don't know what is." The meeting ended with a compromise. Max could stay, but he had to remain leashed in public and was banned from community events. As Sarah left, she overheard 2 mothers arranging playdates to avoid the Williams house with that dangerous animal. Their judgment stung, but later that evening Emily's soft voice broke the silence. "Max, sit, good boy." Her first full sentence in months, and that made it bearable. What unfolded in the weeks that followed was nothing short of remarkable. Emily, who once recoiled from unpredictable movements, began tracking Max's with fascination. She studied the way his ears pivoted toward sounds, learning to predict the world before it arrived. For his part, Max seemed to understand Emily's sensitivities instinctively. Unlike Sarah's well-meaning but sometimes overwhelming gestures, Max never forced interaction. He simply existed beside her, a steady presence offering warmth and security without demand. When thunderstorms sent Emily rocking and covering her ears, Max pressed his body against hers, providing the deep pressure that calmed her. No training had taught him this. It was as if 2 wounded souls had recognized each other, forming their own unspoken language of healing. Sarah documented the changes meticulously, how Emily's vocabulary expanded when speaking to Max, how her meltdowns became less frequent, less intense. The first time Emily fell asleep with her, head on Max's flank, Sarah took a photo. Her first instinct was to send it to Michael. She stopped herself. Instead, she called Emily's therapist, who advised caution. "Dogs don't live as long as humans," she warned. "Emily struggles with change." Sarah knew this, but she also knew that, for now, Max was giving Emily something no therapy ever had. Meanwhile, Max's nightmares lessened too. He no longer startled at every car door slam. The haunted look in his eyes began to fade. Most nights, Sarah found him stationed outside Emily's bedroom door, keeping watch, and on the best days, She caught glimpses of them in the backyard, a little girl resting her small hand on the back of a noble shepherd. And for the first time since Michael left, Sarah felt something settle inside her. Rightness. 20 miles away, in a cramped apartment above a laundromat, Vincent Carter studied an array of photographs spread across a fold-out table. Once a decorated K-9 training specialist, Vincent had been dismissed from the police force for his unorthodox and sometimes cruel methods. Now, he applied the same meticulous attention to planning robberies. His cold blue eyes narrowed as he tapped a particular image, a street view of an affluent neighborhood, large homes set back from manicured lawns. "This one," he said. "The surgeon's house. She's on rotation for the next 3 nights." Jake Morrison, slouched in a chair by the window, looked up. At 34, Jake had never imagined himself a criminal. A framed photograph on his bedside table showed a different life, himself in a mechanic's uniform, his arm around his wife, their daughter Grace grinning between them. That was before his wife left, before Grace's diagnosis, before the medical bills arrived, stamped in red, demanding payment he couldn't afford. "That house has a kid," Jake said quietly. Vincent shrugged, flipping through more surveillance photos. "The mother's hardly ever there. Just some old housekeeper and a little girl who barely speaks. Easy in, easy out." Jake's stomach twisted. As Vincent laid out the plan, security system model, valuable artwork, the safe in the master bedroom. One job, Vincent pressed, sensing his hesitation. "And Grace gets her treatment." As if on cue, Jake's phone buzzed. A message from the hospital. A reminder. The $177,000 deposit was due for his daughter's experimental treatment, not covered by insurance. He thought of Grace's thinning frame, her once boundless energy now, reduced to a hospital bed. "What about the dog?" Jake asked, glancing at a surveillance photo of a German shepherd. Vincent's expression darkened, then twisted into a grin. "Just some pet. Nothing I can't handle." He didn't mention what he had recognized in the animal's stance, the way it scanned its surroundings in calculated sweeps. The subtle shift of its weight, always positioning itself between the child and the street, hallmarks of elite police training. Vincent had trained dogs like this before. Some information was best kept to himself, especially when it made things interesting. This wasn't just about money. This was about proving his superiority over the system that had discarded him. For the 5th consecutive day, Vincent Carter parked his nondescript gray sedan 3 houses down from the Williams residence. Binoculars rested in his lap. Dr. Williams left at precisely 6:45 each morning, white coat visible as she backed out of the driveway. 30 minutes. Later, the housekeeper, Mrs. Parker, arrived in her aging Honda, spent 9 hours inside, and departed by 4:30. The little girl appeared occasionally in the front yard, always with the dog. At first, Vincent dismissed the animal as just another family pet. Then he noticed the details, the way it positioned itself between the child and the street, the systematic sweeps of its gaze, the way its ears constantly adjusted, tracking distant sounds. Vincent murmured to himself, recognizing his own past teachings. Yesterday, a delivery truck had backfired. The dog had stiffened, but hadn't bolted. Instead, it had turned. Calculated the threat, held its ground. Vincent smiled. "Oh, this is going to be fun." Max positioned himself protectively near Emily, scanning for threats with the silent vigilance of a soldier. Vincent pulled out his laptop, fingers moving swiftly across the keyboard as he accessed a law enforcement database, an old colleague's login still proving useful. Cross-referencing recent K-9 retirements with the shepherd's description, he found what he was looking for: K-9. Officer Max, retired following handler casualty. Officer James Jenkins. Vincent's thin lips curved into a slow smile as he studied the service photograph. "Hello, old friend," he murmured. Memories surfaced. Years ago, before his dismissal, he had evaluated this very dog as a puppy. Vincent had deemed him too soft for police work. That recommendation had been overruled by his superiors. Now seeing Max's decorated service record, bitterness coiled in Vincent's throat. This wasn't just a burglary anymore. It was an opportunity to prove he had been right all along. The dog was a complication, but one Vincent looked forward to handling. Personally, Mrs. Eleanor Parker had worked for wealthy families for over 40 years, maintaining an impeccable record despite the secrets she collected like loose change in her pockets. Behind her kindly grandmotherly demeanor, silver hair always neatly pinned, blouse buttoned precisely to the throat, she harbored a lifetime of quiet resentments. Decades of cleaning up after people who never truly saw her. The Williams household was no different. Dr. Williams was courteous but distant, too preoccupied with hospital emergencies to notice when Mrs. Parker rearranged the bookshelves or prepared elaborate meals that went uneaten. The child was different, odd, unsettling with her silent stares and meticulous arrangements of objects. And the dog? It watched Mrs. Parker, always watching. As if it could read her thoughts, when the man had approached her outside the grocery store 3 weeks ago, showing her photographs of her son visiting a known drug house, explaining how easily those photos could reach his parole officer. Mrs. Parker had refused at first, but the man Vincent he called himself was persuasive. "Just information," he had assured her. "No one gets hurt, and your son stays free." The first betrayals were small. The security code, Dr. Williams's schedule, the location of valuable items. Mrs. Parker justified each one as self-preservation, not malice. After all, insurance would cover whatever was taken. But last night, Vincent had asked for something more. Disable the dog. He had pressed a small vial into her palm. Mix this into his food tomorrow evening. Now, standing at the kitchen window, Mrs. Parker watched Emily methodically brushing Max's coat, whispering softly into his ear. Her fingers trembled as they brushed against the vial in her pocket. She had convinced herself no one would be physically harmed, but as she stared at the child leaning against the shepherd's sturdy frame, that comforting fiction dissolved. The dog would be unresponsive when Vincent and his partner arrived, and the child would be unprotected. Mrs. Parker considered calling Dr. Williams, but she could already imagine the disappointment in the doctor's voice, the anger, and then there was her son, finally sober, holding down a job. One call from Vincent and that would be gone. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Emily looked up suddenly, her gaze unnervingly perceptive. Their eyes met through the glass. Mrs. Parker turned away first, shame burning in her throat like bile. The call came at 7:23 p.m. Sarah was finishing post-operative notes on a successful heart valve repair for a 2-year-old patient when her phone vibrated against the desk. Mrs. Parker's voice carried an edge of worry. "Emily's fever started this morning, 101.2. I gave her Tylenol, but now it's 103.8. She's not responding to the medication." Sarah's stomach tightened. "She's asking for you." That detail hit the hardest. Emily rarely asked for anyone, especially not her mother. Sarah gripped her phone, warring between duty and instinct. The emergency valve replacement was scheduled in 40 minutes. A 7-month-old with little chance of surviving the night without intervention. But Emily's history of febrile seizures flashed through Sarah's mind, along with the pediatrician's warnings about her daughter's unstable temperature regulation. "I'll be there as soon as I can," Sarah promised, already striding toward her department chief's office. The conversation was brief and tense. "This is the 3rd emergency this month, Williams," Dr. Hoffman said, his gray eyebrows drawing together. "We've accommodated your situation, but there's a child on the table who needs the best surgeon available." The unspoken accusation hung in the air. One child, her child, against another who depended on Sarah's skills to survive. Before she could answer, Dr. Anderson from cardiology stepped forward. "I'll cover the surgery," he offered. Relief flooded through Sarah. She was already reaching for her coat. Dr. Hoffman's voice was measured, but the warning was unmistakable. "Anderson can handle it, but the board meets next week to review your application for department head. This won't help your case. Sarah paused, fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. She understood exactly what she was risking. Then her phone buzzed. Mrs. Parker, fever down to 102.1, managing better. No need to rush home. Sarah hesitated, torn between her doctor's instincts and a mother's intuition. Finally, she exhaled. Tell Dr. Anderson I appreciate the offer, but I'll perform the surgery as scheduled, she told Hoffman, typing a quick reply to Mrs. Parker. Sarah, keep monitoring. Call if anything changes. We'll be home by midnight. As she turned toward the surgical wing, Sarah's thoughts drifted to Max, the one presence in Emily's life that had never disappointed her. Watch over her, she whispered. A silent prayer to a dog who, in just a few months, had become her most trusted partner in parenthood. Mrs. Parker moved through the Williams home with the practiced efficiency of someone who knew every inch of it. Her hands, spotted with age, but still strong, wiped down already gleaming countertops, straightened cushions that were already perfectly aligned. Busy work. A futile attempt to silence the guilt gnawing at her. Upstairs, Emily had finally fallen into a restless sleep, her fever stubbornly hovering at 102 degrees. Through the partially open bedroom door, Mrs. Parker could see Max lying beside her bed, head resting on his paws, eyes never leaving the child. She had tried twice to coax him downstairs for his evening meal, the one she was supposed to lace with Vincent's sedative. Max refused to leave his post. You know something's wrong, don't you? She whispered, meeting the shepherd's unblinking gaze before looking away. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9. Each strike tightened the knot in Mrs. Parker's stomach. Vincent and his partner were supposed to arrive at 11. By then, the dog was meant to be unconscious. The job simple, an easy target. Mrs. Parker stood at the bottom of the stairs, the small vial cold between her fingers, and made a decision. She walked to the kitchen, poured Max's food into his bowl, hesitated, then turned toward the sink, twisting open the vial, and emptying its contents into the garbage disposal. The quiet hum of the motor filled the kitchen as she watched the liquid vanish. She felt neither relief nor righteousness, just the hollow certainty that her choice would have consequences. She picked up her phone, intending to call Dr. Williams, fabricate some excuse for why she needed to leave early. Then she heard it, the crunch of tires on gravel. Her breath caught as she moved to the window. A gray sedan pulled up across the street. Vincent, 2 hours early, Mrs. Parker's blood turned to ice as she watched him step out, another man following. Both were dressed in dark clothing, moving with purpose. Her phone slipped from her trembling fingers, clattering against the tile. She turned toward the stairs, panic surging in her chest. Emily, she gasped. She had to get to the child. Lock the bedroom door, call for help. She made it 3 steps before the sound of shattering glass ripped through the house. Max's warning bark erupted from upstairs. Then, the rapid click, click, click of his nails on hard wood as he tore down the stairs, passing Mrs. Parker in a blur of muscle and fur. Max, no! She called weakly, knowing what awaited him. But the shepherd had already disappeared into the darkness of the kitchen. The back door swung open, a moment of profound silence. Then, a startled curse, a guttural growl, the sharp crash of furniture overturning. Vincent recovered fast. Years of training police dogs had taught him exactly how they attacked, and more importantly, how to counter them. Max lunged. Vincent pivoted sharply, using the dog's momentum to throw him off balance. Jake, the muzzle! It's in my pack! He barked at his partner. Jake stood frozen in the doorway. Max recovered instantly, circling Vincent with deadly precision. His body low, muscles coiled, waiting for an opening. Vincent reached for the light switch, flooding the kitchen with harsh fluorescent light. The scene crystallized. Max, teeth bared in silent warning. Mrs. Parker, trembling at the hallway entrance. Jake, his face a mask of horror. You said the dog would be out. Jake's voice cracked. You said no one would get hurt. Vincent didn't acknowledge him. His focus was entirely on Max. The shepherd's ears flicked, tracking every move. His hackles bristled, his breath slow and measured. Waiting. "Mrs. Parker," Vincent said smoothly, eyes never leaving the dog. "I see our arrangement has been reconsidered." The older woman's face crumpled. "I couldn't do it," she whispered. "Not to the child, not to him." Vincent nodded, as if merely noting an inconvenience. Unfortunate but manageable. From his jacket pocket he withdrew a small device, a slim metallic cylinder. With a click, a high-pitched frequency filled the room, silent to human ears but agonizing to K-9's. Max recoiled instantly, ears flattening against his skull. His teeth clenched as a whimper slipped from his throat, his body trembling from the assault. Vincent's lips curled into a knowing smirk. "Still too soft," he muttered. He stepped forward. Max staggered. Mrs. Parker's breath hitched. Emily stirred upstairs. Jake's fingers twitched toward his belt. And then, Max shook his head violently, his ears flicking in rapid succession. His legs stiffened. His golden brown eyes lifted, and Vincent's smirk vanished. Because the shepherd wasn't backing down. He was adjusting, recovering. And this time, when Max's gaze locked onto Vincent's, there was no hesitation, only pure, unwavering intent. Max whined, shaking his head violently before dropping into a crouch, his paws scratching desperately at his ears. Vincent smiled, stepping forward with confidence. "Police dogs have such sensitive hearing," he mused. "It's one of the first vulnerabilities I identified in the training program." Mrs. Parker moved before she could think, maternal instinct overriding fear. "Stop it. You're hurting him." Vincent backhanded her with casual brutality. The force sent the elderly woman crashing into the refrigerator. She slumped to the floor, a thin line of blood trailing down her temple. Jake froze. For the first time, the reality of what they were doing hit him like a freight train. "This isn't what we agreed to," he muttered, taking a step back. "We were just supposed to take valuables, not hurt people." Vincent barely spared him a glance, keeping the sonic device trained on Max. "Plans change," he said coolly. "Now either help me secure this animal, or get upstairs and find the items we came for. Your daughter still needs that treatment, doesn't she?" Jake stiffened. The mention of Grace silenced his protest, guilt and shame twisting inside him like a knife. He looked at Mrs. Parker's still form, at Max, struggling against the unbearable sound waves. Then, at the image burned into his mind. Grace, in her hospital bed, growing weaker by the day. Jake clenched his fists. "I'll check upstairs," he muttered, stepping carefully around Max and heading for the staircase. He didn't see Vincent reach into his jacket, didn't see the small hunting knife glint under the kitchen light as he approached the incapacitated. Shepherd Emily awoke to a house that felt wrong. Even through the haze of fever, her senses prickled with unease. Strange voices downstairs, the absence of Max's warm presence beside her, and worst of all, the high-pitched whine that wasn't quite a sound, something she could feel more than hear, vibrating painfully inside. Her skull. She pulled her blanket tightly around her shoulders, her small fingers gripping the edges. Her first instinct was to hide. The closet. Her safe space during thunderstorms and fireworks. But then, Max. His name slipped from her lips in a whisper, uncertain, afraid. No answering bark, just more noises from downstairs. Struggle. Pain. Emily's breath hitched, her heart hammering in her chest. The hallway stretched before her, dark and unfamiliar. Despite the nightlight's glow, the stairs loomed ahead like a mountain. Fear told her to turn back, but Max was down there, and he needed her. Emily clutched Spotty, her stuffed giraffe, whispering into his worn ear. "We have to help Max." Drawing upon a courage she didn't know she had, Emily stepped forward, one trembling step at a time. Halfway down, she heard it, a man's angry voice, then a sound that made her blood turn to ice. Max's pained yelp, then sudden awful silence. Emily froze. Flight warred with the desperate need to reach her protector. Before she could decide, heavy footsteps approached the staircase. A tall figure emerged from the shadows. Jake Morrison stopped at the base of the stairs, looking up, and locked eyes with Emily. She stood motionless, small and ghostly in her white nightgown, her fever-flushed face eerily pale. Her wide eyes, filled with fever and fear, bore into him with an intensity that stripped away every excuse, every justification he had told himself. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Emily's voice broke the silence. Steady, unshaken. "Where's Max? What did you do to him?" Jake swallowed hard, and for the first time since this night began, he had no answer. There was no answer he could give Emily that wouldn't damn him further, in her eyes and in his own. Behind him, Vincent's voice carried in low, menacing tones. Speaking to someone, the dog, the housekeeper? Jake wasn't sure. What he did know, with sudden crystal clarity, was that he couldn't finish this job, not with this child looking at him the way Grace would, if she ever discovered what her father had become. "Your dog is hurt," Jake finally said, keeping his voice low. "A bad man is hurting him. We need to call for help." Emily's fingers whitened around her stuffed animal, but she said nothing. Jake glanced over his shoulder. Vincent was still occupied. Decision made, he pulled his phone from his pocket and held it out. "Do you know how to call 911? Emily nodded. Solemn and sure, reaching for the device with a steady hand that belied her age. Jake placed it in her palm, then pressed a finger to his lips. "Hide in your room. Lock the door. Make the call." Emily hesitated, her fever-bright eyes searching his face, peering through him as if weighing his soul. "What about Max?" she whispered. Jake felt something crack inside him, the last fragile barrier between the man he used to be and the man he had become. "I'll try to help him," he promised, though he had no idea how he would stand against Vincent. Emily turned and climbed the stairs, silent as a shadow. Jake waited, listening. The soft click of her bedroom door closing sent a ripple of resolve through him. Then, he turned toward the kitchen, toward the monster he had partnered with, toward whatever redemption might still be possible. The scene that greeted Jake would haunt him for years. Vincent knelt beside Max's prone form. The sonic device lay discarded on the floor, replaced by something worse, a hunting knife. Its blade gleamed wetly in the harsh kitchen light. Blood matted the shepherd's fur, soaking the black and tan coat along a deep slash across his shoulder. Yet, Max was still conscious, still struggling weakly to rise. Mrs. Parker remained slumped against the refrigerator, stirring now, small moaning sounds escaping her lips. Vincent looked up. His face was flushed with terrible excitement. "Find anything valuable yet?" he asked casually. As if this were just another job, Jake's eyes locked onto Max. The wound, not deep enough to kill immediately, deliberate, cruel. Vincent had always spoken of his contempt for the department that dismissed him. But this wasn't just about revenge, this was sick. "The girl's awake," Jake said hoarsely. "We need to go, now, before she calls for help." Vincent scoffed. "She's a nonverbal autistic child with a high fever. Who's she? Going to call?" The smug certainty of a man who had studied his targets too well. Jake's pulse pounded in his ears. If Vincent found out he'd given Emily the phone, if he even suspected, there was no telling what he might do. "We should still go," Jake insisted. "This has gotten out of hand. You said no one would get hurt." Vincent rose slowly, wiping the blade clean on a kitchen towel with methodical care. "No one important is hurt," he corrected coldly. "Just a disobedient housekeeper and a dog that should have been put down years ago." He gestured toward the stairs. "With a knife, go find the safe in the master bedroom. I'll finish here and join you." The implication hung heavy in the air, thick as poison. Jake's gaze flicked to Max. Despite the pain, the dog's eyes were still sharp, watching, waiting, a silent plea. And in it, Jake saw himself, wounded, trapped, searching for a way out, a way to be better. Jake made his choice. No. The word came out quiet, steady. He stepped between Vincent and the injured shepherd. Vincent's expression shifted, surprise, then contempt. "No," he echoed, amused. "You're backing out now? What about Grace? What about all those medical bills?" The manipulation hit its mark. Jake felt his resolve waver, but then, a sound from upstairs, a barely perceptible click. Emily. She had either locked herself in or was coming back. Either way, he had to end this now. Before Vincent could turn his attention to the child, Jake clenched his fists. "This isn't about Grace anymore," he said, voice steady. "This is about what kind of father she deserves." And then, he lunged. Jake crashed into Vincent with the full force of his desperation. They slammed against the kitchen island, sending utensils and dishes clattering to the floor. The knife skittered away, vanishing beneath the refrigerator as the two men grappled in frantic, breathless combat. Vincent, though leaner, fought with the calculated precision of someone trained for violence. Jake, driven by something far more primal, met him with sheer, unrelenting determination. Neither man noticed Mrs. Parker regaining consciousness, crawling toward the phone she had dropped earlier. Neither saw Max, his body trembling, his breaths ragged, moving. Despite the blood pooling beneath him, despite the agony that racked his frame, instinct and duty propelled the shepherd forward, one agonizing step at a time. At the top of the stairs, Emily clutched Jake's phone in her small hand. The 911 operator's voice was tinny, distant against the backdrop of breaking glass and the grunts of struggling men. "Hello, is anyone there?" Emily pressed the phone tightly to her ear, summoning words that normally remained trapped behind the walls of her private world. "Bad men," she whispered. "They hurt Max. They hurt Mrs. Parker." Her fever made the room sway, her thoughts slipping, like fish through murky water. But one certainty remained. Max needed her, just as she had needed him. "Sweetheart, what's your address?" The operator's voice sharpened. "Can you tell me where you are?" Emily recited the numbers and street name. Without hesitation, one of the first safety measures her mother had drilled into her. "Good girl," the operator praised. "Police are on their way. Is there somewhere safe you can hide until they arrive?" Emily didn't answer, because downstairs, Max whined. A sound she knew, a sound that meant pain. The phone still connected now. Hanging at her side, Emily moved down the stairs. One step, then another. The kitchen doorway framed a nightmare. Jake and Vincent locked in brutal combat. Mrs. Parker slumped against the refrigerator, her breath shallow, and Max stood swaying on his feet, blood darkening his beautiful coat. Something inside Emily broke. Something that had always kept her silent. "Stop!" The word exploded from her. For a single stunned second, everything froze. Then, Vincent recovered. He shoved Jake hard against the counter and turned, his expression shifting into something predatory, calculating. "Well, hello there," he said, voice falsely gentle. "You should be in bed, little one." Emily didn't retreat. Her fevered gaze locked onto Max. A silent command passed between them, unspoken but understood. Max's ears pricked forward, his posture straightened. Vincent noticed the exchange and paused. For the first time, something like unease flickered across his face. Jake saw his opening. He lunged, knocking the knife from Vincent's grasp. It skidded across the floor, stopping inches from Emily's bare feet. Without hesitation, she scooped it up and backed away, putting it out of reach. Vincent's expression darkened. "Clever girl," he snarled. "But you're out of your depth here." He stepped toward her, then froze. A sound, low, rumbling, growing in intensity, like approaching thunder. "Max." The shepherd stood between Emily and the threat, drawing on reserves of strength only his training, only his bond with her, had made possible. For the first time, Vincent hesitated, because the broken dog he had written off wasn't broken at all. 3 miles away, Dr. Sarah Williams was halfway through a complex valve replacement when her phone vibrated repeatedly inside her locker. Hospital protocol prohibited personal calls during surgery. But something, a mother's intuition, or simply the accumulation of unease throughout the evening, made her glance at the OR clock more frequently. When they finally closed the infant's chest, confirming stable vital signs, Sarah moved with careful efficiency through the post-operative protocols, transferring care to the pediatric ICU team. Only then did she check her phone. 5 missed calls from the home security company, and a single chilling text from an unknown number. Emergency at your home. Police dispatched. The world tilted beneath her feet. Sarah tore through the hospital corridor, still wearing her surgical cap, ignoring the concerned voices of colleagues as she burst into the parking garage. The 20-minute drive home compressed into 12 minutes of white-knuckled terror. Her mind cycled through worst-case scenarios with the clinical detachment that had sustained her through countless medical emergencies. But now, it felt like a cruel dissociation from her daughter's unknown fate. 3 blocks from home, flashing police lights illuminated the night sky. Barricades. Sarah slammed the car into park, barely registering the tires screeching against the pavement. An officer stepped into her path as she abandoned the vehicle, half on the sidewalk. "Ma'am, you can't." "I'm Dr. Williams." Her surgeon's authority cut through protocol like a scalpel. "That's my house. My daughter is in there." Something in her voice, a desperate certainty, made the officer hesitate. Then he nodded curtly. "Follow me." They ran toward the house. More squad cars, an ambulance. Sarah's breath hitched as paramedics wheeled a stretcher toward the waiting vehicle. "Emily!" The scream ripped from her throat, but the figure on the stretcher was too large. Not her daughter. Sarah stopped short, pulse hammering. As she drew closer, she recognized Mrs. Parker's gray hair, her lined face pale against the white sheets. The housekeeper's eyes fluttered open. "I'm sorry," she whispered, a trembling hand reaching for Sarah. "I let him in. I didn't mean to." Paramedics pushed forward, cutting off her words. Sarah stood frozen, processing the betrayal, searching, desperately, for any sign of Emily. Then, another stretcher emerged, this time carrying a man in handcuffs, his face bloodied, his expression defiant. Sarah made an instinctive move toward him, fury burning through the fear. But a police officer gripped her arm. "Dr. Williams, where is she?" "Your daughter is inside. She's safe." Sarah barely heard the reassurance. "Take me to her now." The officer led her through her own front door, into the wreckage of her home, and the moment that would change everything. The house had been transformed by violence, furniture overturned, blood smeared across the kitchen floor, the air thick with tension and the remnants of fear. In the center of the living room, Emily sat wrapped in a shock blanket, unmoving. Beside her, Max lay on his side, eerily still, the shallow rise and fall of his ribcage the only sign of life. A female officer knelt next to them, speaking softly, but Emily's gaze remained locked on Max's face, unresponsive. "Emily," Sarah breathed as she dropped to her knees beside her daughter. "Emily." Slowly, Emily turned. Fever-bright eyes met Sarah's, filled with an expression she had never seen before. Anger, betrayal, and beneath it all, fierce protectiveness. "You weren't here," Emily said, each word a knife of accusation. "Max saved me, and now he's dying." Sarah felt the words like physical blows. She reached for Emily, but her daughter flinched away, pressing herself against Max's uninjured side. The female officer spoke gently. "The paramedics need to transport the dog to the emergency vet, but she won't leave him. And he becomes agitated when they try to separate them." Sarah nodded, understanding instantly. "We'll go together," she said, addressing both the officer and Emily. "I'm a surgeon. I can help stabilize him for transport." She moved toward Max, her professional detachment barely holding back the horror as she assessed his injuries. Sarah worked. She pieced together the story in fragments, Mrs. Parker's complicity and change of heart, Emily's desperate 911 call, and, most incredibly, Max's role in the struggle. Despite his wounds, he had helped subdue the more dangerous intruder. Sarah felt the weight of her absence settle on her shoulders. While she had been saving another child, her own had faced unimaginable terror. Protected, not by her mother, but by a wounded shepherd who had shown more loyalty than she had. "The ambulance is ready for him," an EMT announced. Sarah nodded, helping to carefully transfer Max onto a specialized stretcher. Throughout the process, Emily refused to break contact, her small hand resting on Max's head. The roles had reversed. Now she was the protector and he the vulnerable one. "He's going to be okay," Sarah promised, though her medical instincts warned against assurances. The wound was deep, the blood loss significant. Emily's eyes met hers, sharp and certain. "He has to be," she said. "I told him so, the emergency." Veterinary hospital erupted into controlled chaos when the ambulance arrived. Dr. Chin, the lead veterinary surgeon, took one look at Max and immediately directed her team. "Laceration to the left scapular region, possible arterial involvement, significant blood loss," she dictated as the technicians moved him onto the exam table. Max's eyes, heavy with pain, never left Emily. She stood pressed against Sarah's side, refusing to let go. Dr. Chin paused, recognizing the extraordinary bond. "You must be Emily," she said gently. "Max needs surgery to fix his shoulder. We'll take good care of him, but you'll have to wait outside while we work." Emily's face crumpled, terror overtaking her earlier stoicism. "No," she whispered, clinging tighter to Max. "He needs me." Sarah knelt beside her, searching for words that might help. "Remember when Mommy does surgery on children? Their parents have to wait outside so I can concentrate." Emily nodded reluctantly. "Max needs the same thing now. Dr. Chin will fix him, but she needs space." Emily hesitated, then moved closer to Max, whispering into his ear. "You have to be brave now. I'll be right outside." Max's tail gave the faintest thump against the table. Dr. Chin, who had worked with countless police dogs, was visibly moved. "He's a fighter," she told Emily, "and he has something very important to come back to." As they moved to the waiting area, a police officer approached with urgent news. "Dr. Williams," Officer Reynolds said, "we've identified both suspects. Vincent Carter was dismissed from the K-9 training program for unethical methods. He had a vendetta against police dogs, especially those that succeeded despite his failures." Sarah swallowed hard, imagining the deliberate cruelty Max had endured. "And the other man?" "Jake Morrison. He's cooperating. Claims he had a change of heart when he saw your daughter and helped protect the dog. His story matches the evidence and your daughter's account." Officer Reynolds hesitated, then added, "There's something else. We found surveillance photos of your family in Carter's car, some from weeks ago. This wasn't a random break-in." A chill spread through Sarah. They had been watched. Her home, her daughter, her routines, all exploited, as if sensing her thoughts, Officer Reynolds added. "Your daughter showed remarkable presence of mind. Not many children her age could have made that call, and stayed calm." Sarah glanced at the glass partition, at Emily sitting rigid in a waiting room chair, her fevered eyes fixed on the surgical suite doors. "She's the strongest person I know," Sarah said quietly. "I just haven't been paying attention." Hours crawled by, marked only by the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock and occasional updates from Dr. Chin's team. Emily refused to sleep, refused medication that might dull her vigilance, a silent rebuke to Sarah's absence. Sarah sat beside her but did not reach for her, respecting the distance her daughter had built between them. She wondered how to rebuild what had been damaged, what had been fractured long before tonight's violence. Finally, at 3 a.m., Dr. Chin emerged, her mask dangling around her neck, exhaustion evident. But in her eyes there was satisfaction. "He's stable," she announced. "The knife missed the artery by millimeters. If it had hit, he wouldn't have made it." She exhaled. "He's incredibly strong." Whatever kept him fighting, it was something special. Emily stood immediately. "Can I see him?" Dr. Chin nodded. "He's still under anesthesia." She led them to the recovery area. Max lay connected to monitors, his shoulder heavily bandaged, an EV delivering fluids and antibiotics. Emily approached slowly, her hand reaching for his paw with infinite gentleness. "I'm here, Max," she whispered. "You did it. You kept your promise." Sarah stood back, watching the depth of their connection. She had failed to nurture this bond with her own daughter. Now, as Max breathed steadily in healing sleep, Sarah made a silent promise to be present in ways that mattered, to recognize the extraordinary gift that had saved Emily when she could not. The next morning, reality set in. Dr. Chin's expression was grave before she even spoke. Sarah listened with the clinical detachment that had carried her through difficult conversations with parents of her own patients. "The damage is extensive," Dr. Chin said, pointing to X-rays. "The blade severed several tendons and damaged the joint capsule. We repaired what we could, but long-term function and pain management are major concerns." Sarah processed the information in silence. "There's more," Dr. Chin continued. "His blood work is concerning. The sonic device Carter used caused internal trauma. We're still assessing, but there's evidence of neurological damage. His balance and coordination may be permanently affected." She folded her hands. Given his age, the severity of his injuries, and the likelihood of chronic pain, many owners would consider humane euthanasia. Sarah's stomach turned. "That's not an option," Dr. Chin nodded. "I anticipated that. We can attempt aggressive rehabilitation, but I need to be honest, he may never regain full mobility. Even with therapy, multiple surgeries, and pain management, there are no guarantees." Sarah glanced at the medical folder Dr. Chin slid toward her. The numbers blurred before her eyes, not from their magnitude, but from what they represented. "There's something else," Dr. Chin said gently. "Police dogs like Max are trained to serve. Some don't adjust when they can no longer work. Depression, anxiety, even aggression." Sarah thought of Max's unwavering focus on Emily, his need to protect even as his strength failed. "He has a new purpose now," she said softly. "He protects Emily. They heal each other." Dr. Chin's expression softened. "That bond may make all the difference, but you need to prepare Emily for the possibility that he may never fully recover." Sarah left the office, those words echoing in her mind. How could she prepare Emily for another loss, when the wall between them felt insurmountable? Built from all the times Sarah hadn't been there, the room was a battlefield. Furniture overturned, blood smeared across the kitchen floor, the air heavy with tension and the echoes of fear. In the center of the living room, Emily sat on the floor wrapped in a shock blanket, her small frame rigid beside Max. The shepherd lay on his side, eerily still except for the faint rise and fall of his chest. A female officer knelt beside them, speaking gently to Emily, but she remained unresponsive, her gaze locked onto Max's face. "Emily," Sarah breathed, dropping to her knees beside her daughter. Emily turned slowly, her fever-bright eyes meeting, her mother's with an expression Sarah had never seen before. Anger, betrayal, and beneath it all, a fierce protectiveness. "You weren't here," Emily said, her voice steady, each word a clear indictment. "Max saved me, and now he's dying." Sarah felt the words like physical blows. She reached for Emily, but her daughter flinched away, pressing herself against Max's uninjured side. The officer spoke quietly. "The paramedics need to take him to the emergency vet, but she won't leave him, and he panics when they try to separate them." Sarah nodded, immediately understanding what had to be done. "We'll go together," she said, addressing both Emily and the officer. "I'm a surgeon. I can help stabilize him for transport." As she moved toward Max, Sarah forced herself into a detached clinical mindset, assessing his wounds even as a deeper horror threatened to consume her. Around her, officers filled in the gaps of the night's events. A break-in, Mrs. Parker's reluctant involvement, her change of heart, Emily's desperate 911 call. And most incredibly, Max, despite his injuries, had fought back, turning the tide of the struggle when the more dangerous intruder gained the upper hand. The weight of it settled on Sarah's shoulders. While she had been saving another child, Her own had faced unimaginable terror, protected not by her mother, but by a wounded shepherd whose loyalty had outshone her own. "The ambulance is ready," an EMT called. Sarah helped them lift Max onto the stretcher. Throughout the process, Emily never let go, her small hand resting on Max's head. The reversal was striking. Emily, always the protected one, now the guardian. "He's going to be okay," Sarah promised, though her medical training made her wary of such reassurances. The wound was deep, the blood loss significant. Emily's eyes met hers with startling clarity. "He has to be," she said simply. "I told him so." The emergency veterinary hospital erupted into controlled chaos upon their arrival. Dr. Chin, the lead veterinary surgeon, took one look at Max's wounds and immediately called for emergency surgery. Laceration near the scapula, possible arterial involvement, significant blood loss, she dictated as Max was transferred to the exam table. The shepherd's eyes remained locked on Emily, who clung to Sarah's side, refusing to be separated. Dr. Chin paused, recognizing the bond. "You must be Emily," she said gently. "Max needs surgery to fix his shoulder. We'll take great care of him, but you'll have to wait outside while we work." Emily's face crumpled. Terror replaced her forced composure. "No," she whispered, clutching Max tighter. "He needs me." Sarah knelt beside her daughter. "Remember when Mommy does surgery on kids? Their parents have to wait outside so I can concentrate." Emily nodded reluctantly. "Max needs the same thing now," Sarah continued. "Dr. Chin has to focus to help him." Emily hesitated, then leaned in close to Max's ear. "You have to be brave now," she whispered. "I'll be waiting right outside." His tail moved, a weak thump against the table. Dr. Chin, who had worked with countless K-9s, was visibly moved. "He's a fighter," she told Emily, "and he has something very important to come back to." As they moved to the waiting area, a police officer approached. "Dr. Williams, we've identified both suspects. Vincent Carter was dismissed from the K-9 training program for unethical methods. He held a personal vendetta against police dogs, especially those that succeeded despite him." Sarah's stomach twisted. She pictured the cruelty Max had likely endured at Carter's hands. "And the other man? Jake Morrison. He's cooperating. Says he changed his mind when he saw your daughter and helped protect the dog. His story matches." "The evidence?" The officer hesitated. "There's more. We found surveillance photos of your family in Carter's car. Some date back weeks." A cold dread settled over Sarah. This wasn't a random break-in. They had been watching, studying her home, her daughter, her routine, exploiting her absence. As if sensing her thoughts, Officer Reynolds added, "Your daughter showed incredible presence of mind. Most kids wouldn't have been able to make that call and stay so calm." Sarah looked through the glass partition at Emily, seated rigidly in a waiting room chair, her eyes fixed on the doors to the surgical suite. "She's the strongest person I know," Sarah murmured. "I just haven't been paying attention." The hours crawled by. Emily refused to sleep, refused medication that might dull her vigilance. Sarah sat beside her, the unspoken distance between them growing heavier. At 3 a.m., Dr. Chin emerged, exhaustion lining her features but satisfaction in her eyes. "He's stable. The knife missed a major artery by millimeters. If it hadn't, he wouldn't have made it here in time. He's incredibly strong." Emily was on her feet immediately. "Can I see him?" Dr. Chin nodded. "He's still under anesthesia." Emily approached Max's recovery bed cautiously, then reached out, her fingers brushing his paw. "I'm here, Max," she whispered. "You did it. You kept your promise." Sarah stood back, watching the bond between them, one she had neglected to foster, with her own daughter. As Max's chest rose and fell in steady sleep, she made a silent promise of her own, to rebuild what had been broken, to be present in the ways that mattered. The next morning, reality set in. Dr. Chin's expression was grave. "His injuries are extensive," she explained, pointing to the X-rays. "We repaired what we could, but there's significant joint damage, severed tendons. His blood work also shows signs of internal trauma. There's neurological concern. Balance and coordination may be permanently affected. She hesitated. Given his age, the severity of his injuries, and the potential for chronic pain, many owners would consider humane euthanasia. Sarah inhaled sharply. She already knew what Emily's answer would be. That's not an option, she said. Emily needs him. Dr. Chin nodded. I thought you'd say that. We can try aggressive rehab, but even with therapy, medication, and possibly more surgeries, his quality of life may be compromised. She slid a folder across the desk. Treatment plans, medication schedules, cost estimates. Sarah barely processed the numbers. Dr. Chin added gently, one more thing to consider. Police dogs like Max are trained to serve. When they can't, they sometimes struggle. Depression, anxiety, even aggression can follow. Sarah thought of Max's unwavering focus on Emily. He has a new purpose now, she said quietly. He protects Emily. They heal each other. Dr. Chin's expression softened. That bond may make all the difference. But you need to prepare Emily for the possibility that Max may not fully recover. Sarah left the office with those words ringing in her ears. How could she prepare Emily for another loss, when her daughter had already lost so much? The knock at the door was hesitant, almost apologetic. When Sarah opened it, a uniformed animal control officer stood there, looking distinctly uncomfortable. I'm sorry, Dr. Williams, he said, holding out an official document. Once Max is medically stable, he'll need to undergo a formal dangerous dog assessment. Until then, he must remain muzzled in all public areas of the hospital. Sarah took the paper, scanning the words in growing disbelief. This is absurd, she snapped. He saved my daughter's life. The officer shifted uneasily. I understand, I don't make the rules. But there have been multiple formal complaints. We're required to follow protocol. He hesitated, lowering his voice. Between us, several officers who responded that night are fighting this. They consider Max one of their own. Sarah exhaled, sharply, her grip on the notice tightening. The idea of restraining Max, forcing a muzzle on him when he had already suffered so much, felt like a cruel injustice. But worse than that, Emily would see it as punishment. Before she could respond, Dr. Chin appeared at the end of the hall, her face unreadable. Sarah barely had time to register the shift in the vet's demeanor before she spoke. Max's latest blood work shows signs of infection, she said quietly. The antibiotics aren't working as well as we'd hoped. If we can't get it under control in the next 24 hours, sepsis becomes a real concern. Sarah felt her stomach drop. She had spent the past week fighting battles on every front, against bureaucracy, against public opinion, against her own guilt. But the one battle she hadn't allowed herself to face was the one she was now losing. Max might not survive long enough to even face an assessment. The thought struck her with brutal clarity. She had been avoiding it, focusing on logistics, legal fights, anything but the reality staring her in the face. Now there was no more time to delay. She had to prepare Emily for what might come. The mechanical hiss of the emergency room doors interrupted her spiraling thoughts. A man strode through the hospital corridor, his charcoal gray suit out of place among the scrubs and police uniforms. Heads turned as he passed. He carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention in courtrooms, but the tightness around his eyes betrayed deeper emotions. Michael Williams. At the reception desk, the nurse barely glanced at him before directing him. Dr. Williams and Emily are in room 114. Max is in critical condition. Michael nodded, his expression unreadable, and continued down the hall. He stopped outside room 114, taking a measured breath before pushing the door open. The scene inside made him pause. Sarah, slumped in an uncomfortable chair, looked like a woman who hadn't slept in days. Emily lay curled against Max's massive form on the specialized veterinary bed, her small hand resting protectively on his bandaged shoulder. Max, once powerful and alert, was now a mass of IV lines and medical monitors, his eyes dull from pain. Medication. Emily noticed Michael first. Her body stiffened, and when she spoke, the word emerged uncertainly. Daddy? Sarah's head snapped up, exhaustion vanishing under shock. Michael? How did you— I've been keeping tabs, he interrupted, smoothly, stepping further into the room. A colleague called me when Emily's name appeared in the police reports. Sarah stood, instinctively positioning herself between him and their daughter. Her voice was low, edged with anger. You've been spying on us? Michael met her gaze without flinching. I prefer to call it maintaining awareness of my daughter's welfare. Given recent events, it seems my concerns were justified. The unspoken accusation hung in the air. Where were you when she needed you? Emily, always perceptive beyond her years, felt the tension and pressed herself closer to Max. And then something unexpected happened. Max, despite his weakened state, stirred at the sound of Michael's voice. His ears flicked forward. His tail gave the weakest of thumps against the bed. A low, almost questioning whine escaped him. Michael took another step forward, his composed facade cracking slightly. He extended a hand, palm down in a gesture that was almost familiar. Hello, friend, he murmured. You've had a rough time, haven't you? Sarah watched in stunned silence as Michael's hand found Max's head. The dog accepted the touch, his eyes fluttering open just enough to recognize something, or someone, long buried in his past. You know this dog, she said, the words more statement than question. Michael kept his gaze on Max as he spoke. I more than know him. I selected him from his litter for the K-9 program 7 years ago. Sarah's breath caught. Michael finally looked at her, his defensive posture easing into something closer to resignation. There's a lot I haven't told you, Sarah. He exhaled. Before law school, before we met, I was a K-9 handler with the police department. I helped train Max when he was a puppy. The revelation landed like a thunderclap. Emily's eyes went wide, darting between her father and Max, as if reassessing everything she thought she knew about both of them. Sarah took a step back, her mind struggling to reconcile the man she had once loved with this new version of him. You never mentioned this, not once. Michael's jaw tightened. It wasn't relevant to the life we were building. I left that career behind after an incident that made me question the entire justice system. Law school was my fresh start. His hand remained on Max's head, and the shepherd, despite everything, seemed comforted by the touch. Sarah's thoughts raced. This explained so much. Max's immediate acceptance of their home, his extraordinary bond with Emily, his relentless drive to protect. You never wondered what happened to him? She asked quietly. Michael's expression darkened. James Jenkins was my best friend in the academy. When I left, he took over Max's training. They became one of the most decorated teams in the department. His voice grew rough. I heard about James's death last year. I had no idea what happened to Max after that. Sarah's mind reeled at the improbable chain of events that had led them here. Before she could speak, the sound of shuffling papers drew their attention. The hospital's conference room had been hastily repurposed into a legal war room. Documents covered the table, a laptop open to municipal statutes. Michael, back in his element, paced as he outlined his strategy to the small group. Sarah, Dr. Chin, and Officer Reynolds, the officer who had responded to Emily's 911 call. The animal control order is procedurally flawed, Michael stated, tapping highlighted sections of the municipal code. Max was acting in defense of a minor child during the commission of a felony. State law explicitly exempts service animals from dangerous dog designations in such circumstances. Officer Reynolds nodded. The department stands behind Max completely. Several officers are prepared to testify about his training and service record. Michael turned to Sarah. You saved lives in the OR, he said. Let me save his. Sarah met his. The weight of everything between them unspoken but understood. For the first time in years, she trusted him, and for the first time in days, she felt hope. As Michael outlined his legal strategy, Sarah found herself watching him with a new perspective. The passion in his voice, the meticulous way he dismantled the animal control order. It reminded her of the man she had once fallen in love with. Before their marriage, before Emily's diagnosis, Michael had been idealistic, determined, willing to fight for what he believed in. Somewhere along the way, those qualities had faded, replaced by long hours in courtrooms and a growing distance at home. Or maybe, she realized, they had never faded at all. He had simply channeled them elsewhere, into battles he knew how to fight, rather than the one that had fractured their family. A voice pulled her from her thoughts. "There's another complication," Dr. Chin interjected. Sarah focused, bracing herself. "Even if we win this legal fight, Max's prognosis remains uncertain. The new antibiotics are working, but the damage to his shoulder is permanent. He'll need extensive rehabilitation and will likely experience some degree of chronic pain and limited mobility." Michael, ever practical, absorbed this with his usual analytical focus. What's the timeline for rehabilitation? What accommodations would he need? Dr. Chin hesitated, as if surprised by his approach. 6 to 8 weeks of intensive therapy, followed by ongoing home exercises. He'll need a single-level living environment, minimal stairs, possibly a ramp for yard access. Pain management will be a long-term consideration. Michael nodded, already making mental calculations. "All manageable," he said with certainty. Sarah felt an odd mix of reassurance and irritation. His confidence had always been one of his greatest strengths, but also one of his most frustrating traits. He tackled everything like a legal case, leaving little room for discussion or compromise. "And Emily?" she asked quietly. "Have you considered what she needs in all of this?" Michael's pen paused mid-note. He glanced up, his expression momentarily unguarded. "Of course," he said. "She needs Max, and stability, and—" he faltered slightly before finishing. "Both. Her parents. The admission cost him something. Sarah could see it. A reluctant acknowledgement that their fractured family still had weight in this decision. Before they could explore this further, Officer Reynolds's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his expression shifting. "There's been a development in the case against Morrison and Carter," he announced. "Jake Morrison has agreed to testify against Vincent Carter in exchange for reduced charges. His statement includes new information about Mrs. Parker's involvement." Sarah tensed at the mention of her former housekeeper. The betrayal still stung, though it was complicated by the knowledge that Mrs. Parker had ultimately tried to protect Emily and Max. "What new information?" Michael asked, his attorney instincts kicking in. Officer Reynolds hesitated, glancing at Sarah before continuing. "Morrison claims Carter blackmailed Mrs. Parker, used her son's parole violations as leverage. She was coerced into providing access to your home." He took a breath before adding, "Morrison also states that Carter specifically targeted your household after recognizing Max as a former police dog. The robbery was secondary. His real motive was a vendetta against K-9 officers." The room went silent. Sarah's blood ran cold. "You mean this wasn't random?" Officer Reynolds shook his head. "Carter had a personal grudge. He didn't just pick your house, he targeted Max." Michael's expression darkened. "Why?" Reynolds hesitated again before answering. "According to Morrison, Carter was dismissed from the K-9 training program for using excessive force on the dogs. He blamed his termination on trainers who disagreed with his methods." Michael's face drained of color. "I was one of those trainers." Sarah stared at him. "What?" Michael's voice was quiet, heavy with realization. "I filed the report that got him dismissed. Carter was technically skilled, but he had no empathy for the dogs. I caught him using excessive shock collar levels to force compliance. He was dangerous." The pieces suddenly clicked together in horrifying clarity. Carter's surveillance, his knowledge of Sarah's schedule, the brutality toward Max. Michael swallowed hard. He knew exactly who Max was. He looked at Sarah, horror dawning in his eyes. "And he knew Max was connected to me." Sarah's breath caught. "You're saying Emily was in danger because of your past? Because of you?" The accusation in her voice was sharp, edged with something deeper: fear, betrayal, disbelief. Michael flinched, but he didn't deny it. "I had no idea Carter was even in this area," he said quietly. "I've been out of law enforcement for years." Sarah pressed a hand to her forehead, trying to steady herself. The irony was unbearable. For years she had resented Michael's absence. Now it seemed that very distance might have been the only thing keeping Emily safe. Until now, the weight of the realization settled over the room, leaving a silence that felt too heavy to break. Finally, Dr. Chin spoke, cutting through the tension with quiet pragmatism. Whatever the motivation behind the attack, the fact remains that Max saved Emily's life, nearly at the cost of his own. Perhaps we should focus on ensuring he receives the recognition and care he deserves, rather than assigning blame. Words settled something in the air, a reminder of the real priority. Michael exhaled slowly, nodding. "You're right. I'll draft a formal response to animal control today and contact the prosecutor's office about the new evidence. The priority is protecting Max and Emily now." For the first time since Michael's arrival, Sarah felt the ghost of something familiar between them, not as husband and wife, but as partners in a fight worth having. "I should check on Emily," she said, rising. "She'll be wondering where we are." Michael gathered his notes, hesitating before asking, "May I join you? I'd like to spend some time with her, if that's okay." The request wasn't laced with his usual assertiveness. It was just a father asking to see his daughter. Sarah studied him for a long moment. She saw the man she had married and the stranger he had become. But now there was context, depth she hadn't seen before. She nodded. "She has questions only you can answer." In Max's hospital room, Michael sat beside the bed, demonstrating the old hand signals he had once used in K-9 training. Emily watched, intently, her usual wariness replaced by something closer to curiosity. "You taught Max to be brave?" she asked. It was one of the longest sentences she had spoken since the attack. Michael considered his answer. "I helped teach him skills, but Max was always brave. That comes from inside." He gestured to Emily's chest, careful not to touch her. "Like you, when you called 911. Emily stroked Max's fur methodically, finding comfort in the repetitive motion. "I was scared," she admitted. "But Max needed me." Michael nodded. "That's what bravery is, doing something even when you're scared." Sarah, watching from the doorway, felt a complex mix of pride and sorrow. Emily had grown in ways no child should have to. Michael continued sharing stories. Max's first training exercises, his mischievous puppy days, his intelligence. Each story built a bridge between father and daughter, formed from their shared love for the shepherd who had brought them together again. Finally, Emily asked the question that had lingered in the air for years. "Why did you leave us?" Michael's practiced explanations about irreconcilable differences, parenting philosophies dissolved. Instead, he answered with unexpected honesty. "I was afraid," he said quietly. "Afraid I couldn't be what you needed. Afraid of failing you." Emily studied his face, her small hand still buried in Max's fur. For the first time in a long time, she truly looked at him. And for the first time in a long time, Michael let himself be seen. Emily studied her father with the same intense focus she gave to mathematical puzzles. "Max was afraid too," she said thoughtfully. "But he stayed with me anyway." The simple statement held a depth that left both parents momentarily speechless. On the bed, Max let out a soft whine, as if affirming his role in their family's fragile reconnection. Before anyone could respond, Officer Reynolds appeared in the doorway, his expression serious. "We just received word from the district attorney's office," he announced. "Vincent Carter has been formally charged with multiple felonies." He listed the charges: animal cruelty, breaking and entering, assault with a deadly weapon, attempted murder. Each word reinforced the weight of what had nearly been lost. His bail has been denied due to flight risk and the premeditated nature of his crimes. Michael exhaled, the tension in his jaw easing slightly. Max's heroism was now undeniable, and his decision to report Carter's abusive training methods all those years ago had been vindicated. "And Morrison?" he asked. Officer Reynolds' tone softened. "Reduced charges, with a recommendation for minimum sentencing, in light of his cooperation." He hesitated before adding, "The DA also discovered his daughter's medical condition and connected his family with a foundation that assists with childhood medical expenses." Michael's surprise was evident. Years spent as a defense attorney had made him cynical about the justice system. But this moment, this rare, unexpected compassion, reminded him of the young officer he once was, before corporate law and emotional distance took hold. Sarah noticed it too. The roads not taken, the choices that had shaped them, seemed suddenly visible in the stark hospital lighting. "There's one more thing," Officer Reynolds continued, a rare smile breaking through his professional demeanor. "The department would like to present Max with an honorary medal for his service. It's usually reserved for officers injured in the line of duty, but an exception has been made." Emily's face lit up, her first real smile since the attack. "Max is still police dog," she declared, placing a protective hand on his fur. "He was just undercover at our house." The innocence of her interpretation lifted the weight in the room, drawing unexpected laughter from the adults. In that moment, something shifted. Not a complete healing, but an unspoken agreement that moving forward together was possible. Max, sensing the change, thumped his tail against the bed in quiet approval. The courtroom was silent as Michael Williams rose to his feet. Though he was accustomed to representing corporate clients today, he stood for something far more personal. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady, "I appear before you not as counsel for the defendant, but as an advocate for a third party, with significant interest in these proceedings, a retired police K-9 named Max." From the gallery, Sarah sat beside Emily, who clutched Spotty the giraffe tightly, watching her father with quiet intensity. Max was still recovering at the veterinary hospital, his fate resting on this hearing. Judge Eleanor Harmon, known for her no-nonsense approach, studied Michael over her reading glasses. "I've reviewed your petition, Mr. Williams. It's unusual to hold a separate hearing on an animal's status during ongoing criminal proceedings." Michael nodded. "Unusual circumstances warrant unusual procedures, Your Honor. While the case against Vincent Carter moves forward, Max remains in legal limbo due to the dangerous dog petition filed by Mr. Finch and others." He gestured toward Walter Finch, who sat rigidly beside his attorney. "This uncertainty is delaying crucial rehabilitation decisions and causing undue stress for my daughter, who witnessed the attack and relies on Max for emotional support." The judge turned to Finch's attorney. "Mr. Daniels, your response?" "Four." Lawyer stood, straightening his tie. "Your Honor, while we sympathize with the Williams family's ordeal, public safety must come first. This animal inflicted serious injuries requiring medical attention. The dangerous dog statute exists for a reason." Michael's grip on his pen tightened, though his voice remained even. "Your Honor, Max was defending a child during the commission of a violent felony. His actions fall squarely within the defensive conduct exemption under state law." He held up a document. "Furthermore, I've submitted affidavits from Max's former handler, his veterinarian, and the responding officers, all confirming his excellent temperament and the extraordinary circumstances of that night." Legal arguments flew back and forth, technical points stacking like chess moves. Emily listened intently, not fully grasping the terminology but sensing that Max's future hung in the balance. Then, during a brief recess, she did something no one expected. She raised her hand. Judge Harmon noticed immediately. "Does the young lady wish to speak?" she asked gently. Sarah's breath caught. "Your Honor, my daughter has autism and limited verbal communication. I don't think I want to talk," Emily interrupted. Her voice was quiet but firm. "About Max." A flicker of something, respect perhaps, crossed the judge's face. She turned to Michael and Sarah. "Mr. Williams, Dr. Williams, Would you be comfortable with the court hearing from your daughter? It's highly irregular, but given the circumstances. Michael and Sarah exchanged glances, measuring Emily's determination against the fragility of her emotions. It's her decision, Michael said finally. She understands what's happening better than we sometimes give her credit for. With gentle guidance, Emily was led to a modified witness stand, exempt from formal swearing in due to her age. Judge Harmon leaned forward. Can you tell me about Max and why he's important to you? What followed was the longest speech Emily had ever given in public. Her voice wavered at times, dipping into near whispers. Occasionally she squeezed Spotty, using the stuffed giraffe as a comfort anchor. But her words emerged with clarity, each one carrying undeniable weight. Max isn't dangerous, she said simply. He's necessary. She hesitated, then continued. He understands when things are too loud or too bright. He knows when I need quiet, when I need pressure. Her fingers curled into Max's absent fur. He taught me to be brave. Then, to everyone's surprise, she turned to Walter Finch directly. He would never hurt anyone who wasn't hurting me first. The sincerity in her voice cut through the courtroom like a blade, accomplishing what legal arguments could not. Judge Harmon's decision came swiftly. The petition to classify K-9 Officer Max as a dangerous animal is denied, she ruled. His actions were consistent with his training and in defense of a minor during a violent crime. He is to be returned to his family and granted full protections as a retired service animal. The gavel struck. Sarah closed her eyes, relief flooding through her. Emily turned to Michael. Max is coming home? Michael's throat tightened. Yes, sweetheart, he said softly. He's coming home. Emily's grip on Spotty loosened slightly as she whispered, He was never just a dog. Michael swallowed hard, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. No, he agreed. He never was. His training and in direct defense of a child during a violent crime. This court finds no evidence suggesting any ongoing risk to public safety. A collective sigh of relief swept through the courtroom. Emily turned to her parents, her small, triumphant smile carrying more emotion than most children could express, with exuberant celebration. In that moment, Sarah saw her daughter's difference not as a limitation but as a rare clarity, a unique perspective that had cut through legal complexities and revealed what truly mattered. Beside her, Michael observed Emily's quiet pride. Any lingering doubts about her ability to navigate the world on her own terms dissolved. The rehabilitation center occupied a former horse ranch 15 miles outside the city, its sprawling grounds adapted for canine recovery. 2 months after the attack, Max moved carefully through a modified obstacle course, his focus unwavering under the guidance of his rehabilitation specialist, Donna. His movements were slower, his left shoulder slightly stiff but functional. Each step carried the careful deliberation of an athlete relearning his body's capabilities. From a bench nearby, Emily counted softly. 27 steps, Max. Good job. The changes in both child and dog were profound. Max had exceeded expectations in his recovery, though he would never regain the effortless agility of his prime. Emily, too, had transformed, not into someone different, but into a more fully realized version of herself. She was still autistic, still processing the world in her own way, but she had found tools to express herself, especially when advocating for Max. Sarah watched from the porch, a patient file in her lap, though she wasn't reading. Her temporary leave from the hospital had evolved into a part-time schedule, balancing select surgeries with being present for Emily in a way she hadn't before. The crunch of gravel announced Michael's arrival. He carried 2 coffee cups, handing one to Sarah before settling beside her. How's he doing? He asked, nodding toward Max and Emily. Better than yesterday, Sarah replied. The new pain meds seemed to be helping without making him too drowsy. They sat in comfortable silence, watching their daughter methodically work through Max's exercise routine, consulting the laminated schedule she carried everywhere. The rhythms of co-parenting had re-established themselves, not identical to before, but perhaps more authentic. Michael took a slow sip of coffee. I spoke with Dr. Chin this morning. She thinks Max will be ready for home care next week. Sarah exhaled, the news settling over her with bittersweet weight. Max's rehabilitation had provided a neutral space for them to rebuild their relationship as parents, sidestepping any conversations about their future as a couple. That's wonderful, she said, then hesitated. But which home? The question had been postponed too long. Michael set his cup down, choosing his words with the precision of an attorney. I've been looking at single-level houses, halfway between yours and my apartment. 3 bedrooms, fenced yard, minimal steps for Max. Something that could work as a shared custody arrangement, with space for Emily's therapy sessions. He glanced at her, searching for a reaction. Unless you've been considering other options. His proposal was practical but layered with meaning. It wasn't a plea for reconciliation in the traditional sense, but an acknowledgement of their shared commitment. To Emily, to Max, to a future that prioritized stability over past mistakes. Sarah considered the unspoken offer. I think Emily would like that, she said carefully, and Max needs both of us now. Michael nodded, his posture easing. I've also been seeing a therapist, he admitted, the words coming slowly. Difficult for a man who had always prided himself on self-sufficiency. Working through some things I should have dealt with years ago. The job stress, the disconnect. With Emily after her diagnosis, they both turned their attention to their daughter. She was demonstrating a stretching technique to Max, her exaggerated movements making the shepherd tilt his head curiously. She's extraordinary, Michael murmured. He exhaled, glancing at Sarah. I'm sorry I couldn't see that before. A lump formed in Sarah's throat. We both made mistakes, she admitted. I buried myself in work, used saving other children as an excuse for not figuring out how to connect with my own. The conversation might have gone further, but Emily's excited voice cut through the moment. Mom, Dad, look! They turned just in time to see Max retrieve a training toy Emily had tossed. His gait was slightly uneven, but his determination was unwavering as he delivered the object to her waiting hands. The simple achievement represented countless hours of patience, rehabilitation, and quiet victories. Emily beamed as she fed Max a small treat from the pouch at her waist, her movements confident and sure. He's getting better, she announced with certainty. I told him he has to be ready for my presentation. Her presentation was scheduled for the following month, a special school assembly where Max would be officially recognized as a therapy dog, eventually visiting classrooms to support children with sensory processing challenges. Emily had been rehearsing daily, her determination overriding the communication difficulties that once held her back. Watching her, Sarah realized how much they had all been changed by Max's presence. Emily had found her voice, literally and figuratively. Michael had reconnected with a part of himself that years of law had buried. And Sarah had learned that being present wasn't just about time. It was about truly seeing her daughter for who she was, not who she had once imagined her to be. Max completed another successful retrieval, his tail wagging in quiet satisfaction. Their family had been fractured, then pieced back together into something new. Not perfect, not without challenges, but strong in a way that mattered most. Like Max's injured shoulder, they had healed, not seamlessly but functionally. Their resilience had become their strength. In the quiet moments of life, we often discover our greatest strengths. Max and Emily's story is a reminder that healing doesn't follow a straight path. It weaves through unexpected connections, restoring what time and hardship have broken. Like Max, many of us carry invisible wounds, the separation from loved ones, the fear of being left behind, the uncertainty of our purpose as life changes. But this remarkable shepherd teaches us that our value never fades. It simply transforms. Our greatest contributions may come when we least expect them, in moments of love and protection that require no words. Family bonds, though stretched and tested, retain their essential strength in times of crisis. For those feeling displaced in a rapidly changing world, remember this: your experience and steady presence offer sanctuary to the younger generations navigating their own storms. Like Emily finding her voice through Max's unwavering support, your patient guidance creates safe harbors where healing begins. Your second act in life may hold your most meaningful role yet, not as who you once were, but as who you become through every challenge you overcome. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to subscribe. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. See you in the next video.